Okay, I was trying to respond to the noble lady's request not to be intervened during her what she had to say, so that she could do it first. But I did have some questions actually specifically on what she was talking about, and as I say, I was trying to follow her wishes on that, and so my concern now is that she won't have the opportunity to answer those questions. Okay, but thank you. So it's specifically around the point, and I totally appreciate the noble lady's intention in all of this is obviously to try and make it as a robust a process as possible, and obviously showed a very moving example there of why she believed it. But my specific question is that surely the people best placed to give evidence and understand the situation on the capacity of the person involved, whether there is any coercion involved, their own circumstances, are the very people that she's suggesting shouldn't be part of that panel, namely the health professionals involved and the doctors. So I'm just again trying to understand why the noble lady wouldn't want those professionals involved who are closest to the case involved.
Respond. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that the noble lord quite heard me right, because the panels that we were discussing previously didn't have the treating clinicians on that panel. They were looking at evidence brought to them, and indeed in the proposal of the panel structure that I put down, it would be that panel that would have access to all the patient's notes with the patient's permission, all their investigations, and the full assessment of capacity and all other aspects that would be happening in routine practice during the patient's care, and concerns over their family, over behaviours during the course of their illness would be documented in the clinical record, and that clinical record would be available to the panel, including the criteria on which the diagnosis was made, which is why I have suggested there needs to be an expert with knowledge of the specific disease of the person who is seeking an assisted death, because there are many rare conditions in medicine. Common things occur commonly, but rare things are not that uncommon, and it is quite common for there to be a misdiagnosis, so the patient may be making a decision based on a fallacy, believing what they had, or even what they had been treated for. And we had evidence in a previous select committee that at post-mortem, around 5% of people are found to have died of something different to what had been recorded on the death certificate, suggesting that misdiagnosis is sadly not a very rare occurrence.
So the specific point I was referring to is the person's health or social care professional cannot participate in any part of the assessment for that person's request for an assisted death. That's the point I'm trying to understand. Yes, unfortunately, there are cases of misdiagnosis, the 5% the noble lady mentioned, but actually the 95% of the time, vast majority, these people are the best qualified to make an assessment on it. So I'm trying to understand why we wouldn't want them involved.
Because they won't be involved in the judgment as to whether the person is eligible for lethal drugs or not eligible for lethal drugs. They are providing their clinical expertise and knowledge. It is the panel who separately, independently, through a process that can be completely scrutinised and documented, who would then make that assessment completely independently. It means that the patient's care cannot be contaminated by pressures of the doctor being burnt out, by financial pressures on the system in which that patient is being treated, or even by administrative pressures because the patient's discharge is becoming difficult, and because there are beds that are needed and there are patients being treated in corridors, which we know is happening all the time. It provides separation and a degree of clarity over the assessment and judgment.
can I make a point of clarification that even whether we take the system proposed by my noble friend or the original system with the series of doctors, it is very unlikely under any circumstance that the clinician who is providing primary care for the patient will also be in one of those formal roles specified by the bill. And the reason for that is that, as we've discussed, people will need to opt in to take on that kind of role and have very specific training for it. And given the numbers that are predicted to require an assisted death, that will be quite a small cadre of clinicians. So in practical terms, although I understand the aspiration from the sponsor in the other place and certain members here that there is this close integration between the team providing normal care and those involved in the dying process, in practice, I don't see that that would be feasible in either system.
Thank you.
My Lords, I would like to express the, the opposite view to the noble Lady Finlay that we should have a separate service, completely separate. We're going to target and isolate people who are dying. And it seems to me crucial that they will wish to be supported around them by the people who they've known through the course of the illness, that we should not move them to another place, that they should be seen and examined there. Yes, it's going to be a separate people, perhaps, who take on this role, and they should be properly qualified and discuss it with the panel and whatever. But it is utterly crucial that we should not separate these people off when they are in the process of dying and reject them. They should be part of the palliative care provided to them. It almost certainly in other countries usually happens as part of a palliative care service. That's how it is in Oregon and Washington, and very successfully so. We should not separate them off. We are there to support them during this process. And these little nitpicking bits of change to the bill will just make it worse.
My Lords, I wasn't going to speak on this, but the last speaker has led me to do so. First of all, to talk about the care with which this proposal has been put forward as nitpicking is frankly unacceptable. And the noble lady should not have said that, because the reason this has been brought forward is because many of us feel that we should take seriously the pressures of the people who are going to have to carry out these arrangements, all of whom, either in principle or because of the nature of the bill, have objections to the bill. So one tries to find answers, and one of my sadnesses is that the noble lord the sponsor of the bill, has so far not, it seemed to me, met the questions which have been put forward by the Royal Colleges. Or indeed, and I say this to the noble Baroness, or indeed to the committees of this House that have suggested that the fact that this bill is so unclear over so many things is not an acceptable way of legislation, that we need to be much more precise and much less vague. Now, it may be, I will give way to the noble lady.
The fact of the matter is that many of the things we're discussing in normal medical and social legislation would be contained in codes of practice, and they will certainly need to be worked up in great detail in order that some of these issues can be covered. But it is not necessary to put them in primary legislation. For example, the carting of medication around between a pharmacy and the doctors, that is in a code of practice which is quite straightforward, and that needs to be done in detail, I agree, so that practitioners who are actually implementing the legislation can do it with confidence and so that it can be monitored. There is no good putting it in primary legislation, which will inevitably change. When processes change, habits change.
That may well be the view of the noble lady, but it is not the view of the Royal Colleges, and it is not the view of the select committees that have looked at this, of this House. So it is perfectly reasonable for me to suggest that there is an alternative. And I am suggesting an alternative to the lady, the noble lady, and I'm still sorry that she should think that the word nitpicking was a suitable phrase to use to people who have spent their lives working on these issues and are trying to find answers to meet the problems which have clearly been raised by this bill. And most of us who have views on this subject have been extremely careful in the language that we've used and have respected the views of those with whom we are fundamentally disagreed, but we have done so with great care. So may I explain why I think we should consider these amendments very carefully? I am not expert enough to say that this bit or that bit is the right answer to this. But what I think we do have to say is that this is precisely the kind of information which ought to be in the bill and which is not in the bill. This is the sort of answers which most people who are expert in this matter and have given evidence to the various select committees have asked for. It should not have been needed as an amendment. It should have been presented by the noble and learned Lord and those who are putting forward this bill, because we need to know this before we vote for it, not afterwards. And that is the problem which the noble Baroness is avoiding. What we're being asked to do is to pass a bill and then leave so much to things that we have absolutely no knowledge of how that will be done. There is a second reason why it is important to take very seriously these amendments, and it is the relationship between patient and doctor. Now, my one expertise is having spent nearly 40 years as a Member of Parliament representing constituency. And it's all very well for those who are perhaps removed from the generality of the population. But one of the things you learn in your weekly surgery and going round your constituency is the degree of fear that people have about doctors and hospitals. It just, when you do this work, and I think anyone who is concerned from a pastoral point of view, here is a non-religious element for bishops and for ministers of all sorts, know very well that this is a fundamental fact that you find everywhere. Now, one of the problems, even for those who are in favour of the principle of this bill, is that it does increase the fear among many people. And therefore, ensuring that there is a service which is separate, clearly separate, unconnected in any but that necessary connection to which the noble Baroness has pointed, with the care that has taken place, is hugely important. And I will return now to the reason why I rose, because it wasn't just the phrase nitpicking that the noble Baroness mentioned, but it was her belief that assisted suicide is part of palliative care. What she said was that is the fundamental wrongness of this proposal. Because if you say that, then you are saying to people, if you put yourself in the hands of doctors, they will be thinking of palliative care which includes this. That is not palliative care. Of course, nearly 50% of the people who hear about assisted dying think that assisted dying refers to palliative care. But they don't mean by palliative care that you are in fact inviting the opportunity to kill yourself. They see that as a wholly separate thing. And all that I am saying is that if we want to protect people in general, We have to be quite clear that palliative care, looking after people in the very best way that we can in the most difficult time of their life, is utterly separate from the idea that they can instead decide to kill themselves. Now, it is perfectly reasonable for some people to want to have that choice, but it must be a distinct choice. It must not be mixed up. Now, there is a third reason for that. The thing that I don't normally lose my temper, but I did last week, when over lunch I discovered that my local health authority had removed, I think it was £176,000 from Marie Curie, which meant that they were then unable to provide overnight care for people in real difficulty. That reminds me of the fundamental issue that we face, which is where do we put our resources? We must not confuse assisted suicide with palliative care. We must ask ourselves, if we have limited resources, what is the argument for spending about 40% of the cost of hospices and 100% of the cost of assisted dying? How does one put those two things together? Morally, leave alone practically. But even if you are prepared to say that this is such a priority that you can spend £31 million on it, even if you're prepared to do that, the one thing you have to have is a clear distinction between those choices. And I must thank the Baroness for what she said, because what she has revealed is what we've always feared, which is that this would become a cheap alternative to looking after people. I will in a moment, but I wish to finish my sentence.
Order.
A cheap alternative to being a society that cares for people right to the end of their lives. And I do know what sort of society I want to live in. I want to live in a society that looks after the most vulnerable at the most vulnerable time. And if they are to be given that alternative, it clearly is unconnected with the fundamental moral duty of a society, which is to look after those who can't look after themselves.
The noble lord, before he sits down, how are we looking after the most vulnerable at the most vulnerable time of their life if we isolate them from those who have given them care in the most difficult time of the life when they are about to die?
The proposal here is not isolating them. In all the things that matter, it's doing something quite different. It's saying that those who are looking after them continue to look after them and give the information that is necessary for those who are going to make judgments to make those judgments. It is making a distinction between care, which is the people we're talking about, and a decision about life and death, which should not be made by the people who are looking after them, but the information that those people who are looking after them should be provided for those who are making an objective decision. That is why putting the carefulness at the heart of what we do and putting the rest to one side is a proper way of dealing with it.
May I ask the noble lord, because he was at pains to try and say there that he felt that somehow suggesting assisted dying wasn't a compassionate part of care. Would he accept that for some people, actually it is the true definition of compassion? And noble lords have heard me say on many occasions that when my mother was terminally ill, and it was suggested that we might help her take an earlier train home, that was absolutely the compassionate thing that she and others wanted, and that for all the supporters of assisted dying in this House and all the supporters of assisted dying in this country, about 70% of people of every religion, disabled, every group you talk about, it is because they believe that that is the most compassionate thing they can do to give the person the autonomy of their own choice on how they want to end their suffering.
One of the problems of using the word compassionate is it is a mechanism for suggesting that one's own answers to these issues is compassionate and other people's are not. So let me just say, I happen to think that the most compassionate way of dealing with this is, first of all, to have a society in which we have palliative care of the highest standard for everybody. I then think that if you have that, it may be that some would believe that it would be better for them to make a choice to kill themselves. If that is the case, and this is what we're debating, we're not debating the principle, we're debating how you do this. That's all the question is. I have given a clear statement about what my principled views are, but I'm talking now about the facts of this issue. So first, you have to show that you have proper palliative care. Secondly, you have to accept that there will be, in the course of this bill, there will be the opportunity for people to decide. Now, who should make that decision? Well, the problem is that if you have proper palliative care, that will continue, or ought to continue. All the information that those people have should be given to the people who are making that decision. The noble lord, my friend, is absolutely right. There are those who feel that this is a compassionate answer. I am suggesting that if they feel that, the opportunity to make that choice should not be in the hands of the people who are actually looking after them. And I've tried to explain, first because it makes many people more frightened about hospital, secondly, it confuses their relationship with the doctors, and thirdly, it is very difficult to see that all those people who are looking after people will want to be involved in this. And fourthly, it begins to get closer to what the people, those who support the bill, demand that carry it through. We are trying to find an answer. And if the sponsors of the bill don't like this particular answer, perhaps they can come forward with a proper programme for how you do this, instead of leaving it to the vagueness which our own select committee has said is unacceptable.
It seems to be becoming a regular feature of these committee sessions that the noble Lord Deben and I seem to disagree, but I think we disagree with courtesy, and I hope we disagree on the basis of real understanding. But I would ask him to accept, and I do feel it's extraordinary that we've got to this stage in the bill and the noble lord doesn't seem to accept that those, I don't say on this side of the House, because it isn't an on this side of the House issue, but those of us who support this bill are in favour of palliative care. We have always been in favour of palliative care. We have always said that the two go together. And I would ask the noble lord, I have not had the honour of serving in the other places he has done, but I have had experience, both in sitting on other select committees of your lordship's House on this particular matter, not the immediately past one, but others, where we have looked in detail and actually travelled to those places where assisted dying is in place. And there is absolutely no evidence that assisted dying, when introduced, does anything other than improve palliative care, because it improves the understanding that people have of discussions about end-of-life care, of death, of the general issue, which can be debated more openly. And I would say, and I'm not in a sense trying to take Baroness Murphy's point, Noble Lady Baroness Murphy's point any further, but I do think one of the things which has concerned us in this committee is that there is so much emphasis in so many of these amendments on the detailed administration. She used the word nitpicking, which you didn't like, but the very, very small print of administration and so much less focus on those people who are actually going to hope to take advantage of this legislation. The patients, the people who are dying, the people who are reaching the end of their life. And I have become, I remember in a previous debate, my noble friend Lady Hayter said this, I have been rather shocked by the emphasis, for example, on the bureaucracy of the Commission, of its structure, etc., which has not emphasised the position of those people who are dying.
My Lords, I wonder if I could just remind the House of the extraordinary common sense of the noble Lady Cass, who pointed out the may well be a lack of suitable doctors of one sort or another, and they may have to put up with what actually is the reality.
My Lords, I would like to endorse my noble friend Lady Finley's amendments very fully, because I think they would deserve rereading. I think there has been a huge misunderstanding of what she actually described. And this wasn't something drafted on the back of an envelope. This is years of work thinking about how this could work. Her amendments simplify and strengthen the bill, making the whole process more transparent and more likely to be subject to evidence-based improvement in the future if an assisted death service is approved. And my noble friend's amendments may go some way to addressing the continuing concerns of the medical royal colleges. My main amendments in this group, however, concern the regulation of substances proposed for use in assisted dying. I recently co-authored an editorial in BMJ Supportive and Palliative Care called Untested, Unlicensed, Unregulated, Prescribing and Oversight Issues in Physician-Assisted Dying or Suicide. I thank the noble and learned Lord Faulkner for tabling amendments that attempt to address these matters. My amendments 624A and 708A would amend the noble Lord's amendments. In this country, drugs intended for clinical use are subject to evaluation and oversight by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Authority, the MHRA, which assesses their efficacy, quality and safety before they can be licensed for human use. These frameworks were specifically designed to ensure that drugs used in healthcare meet appropriate evidence and safety standards before they reach patients. I asked the noble and learned Lord why he is reluctant to rely on the established regulatory framework and instead proposes the development of a separate framework specifically for substances used in assisted dying. My amendments to the noble Lord's amendments, as well as my amendments 699 and 709, propose that the Secretary of State, when specifying a substance in regulations, must have regard to recommendations of the MHRA, and that the established committee is required to report to the MHRA. One possible interpretation for the creation of a parallel regulatory framework is that the substances to be used under the bill are not medicines in the conventional sense, nor part of a standard healthcare intervention, and therefore not subject to the usual evidence requirements and regulatory expectations. My Lords, if this is the case, it raises an important question about whether such substances properly belong within a healthcare system at all. Doctors within the NHS prescribe treatments that are supported by evidence, assessed through established regulatory pathways and embedded within recognised guidelines, such as those produced by the National Institute for Clinical Evidence, NICE. If the substances proposed for assisted dying are to sit outside such frameworks, then the rationale and indeed the ethics of introducing this practice into the NHS and requiring the involvement of doctors and other clinicians becomes rather worrying. I partly address this through my Amendment 712 that mandates prescribing standards and Amendment 626A that seeks to remove the requirement for a doctor's prescription and enables direct dispensing by a specialist registered pharmacist. If the House takes the view that the MHRA is not currently equipped to regulate substances in this context, then the logical response would be to adapt or expand the MHRA's remit so that it can develop a suitable regulatory pathway, something that I propose in my Amendment 713A.
My Lords, it may be helpful to note that for the purposes of veterinary euthanasia, the drugs are subject to formal evaluation and authorisation by the Veterinary Medicines Directorate under the relevant regulations. It seems difficult to justify a position in which substances used to end the life of animals are required to meet the usual regulatory standards, while substances intended to end human life would be introduced through a novel and less clearly defined regulatory process. In the House of Commons, my Lords, amendments proposing MHRA involvement were resisted on the grounds that such requirements might make the bill more difficult to implement. Expediency and legislative convenience, however, cannot reasonably justify bypassing the usual regulatory framework. There is also very limited evidence behind the substances used for the purposes of assisted dying. My Lords, the evidence that such drugs reliably produce a peaceful and predictable death remains limited. In a number of jurisdictions where these substances are administered orally, the reported time to death varies widely, sometimes extending over many hours or even days. Despite assertions in the media, the truth is that an assisted death is not always peaceful. The limited published evidence, for example from Oregon in 2023, detailed very common complications in 10% of cases, including vomiting, seizures, and instances of procedural failure. The median time to death was 53 hours. There's an important gap in the evidence regarding the predictability and safety of the drug regimens used for this purpose, and addressing these uncertainties normally requires systematic evidence generation through properly designed studies. Where randomised controlled clinical trials are considered ethically or practically inappropriate, alternative approaches such as prospective observational or structured real-world evidence generation studies are commonly used to obtain appropriate data. What cannot be relied upon is an assumption that such evidence will simply emerge over time and be available for the Secretary of State to evaluate. If evidence is not currently available, then it must be deliberately gathered through an appropriate research framework, and this is what I propose in Amendment 713. Body best placed to oversee such a process is the MHRA, which already has the expertise and regulatory infrastructure to evaluate drug trials. My Amendment 711 would require that the Commissioner work collaboratively with the MHRA to establish and maintain a list of approved lethal substances. My Lords, it's been suggested in previous debates that the necessary evidence already exists in other jurisdictions and that the drugs are already licensed and available in the UK, merely lacking authorisation for this particular indication. But this is simply not true. For example, the barbiturates used in Australia, phenobarbital usually, is not licensed or available for human use in the United Kingdom. And the drug regimen actually referenced in the government's impact assessment is based on an experimental combination of 5 different drugs, that has emerged in certain jurisdictions after the original barbiturate-based protocols became difficult to obtain. This combination of drugs was introduced largely out of necessity rather than through a formal programme of drug development. The available data, my Lords, regarding its efficacy, the pharmacokinetics and the safety remain limited. Reports from these jurisdictions describe significant adverse effects, including prolonged dying and even not dying. Practically speaking, there are no drugs that are both available and licensed in the United Kingdom for the purpose of assisted dying. And if such lethal substances are to be introduced, they would need to be subject to the same evidential standards and regulatory scrutiny that apply to any other drug intended for use in patients. Finally, my Lords, my Amendment 552A seeks to ensure that pharmacies are limited to storing and dispensing approved substances rather than preparing them. Permitting preparation risks bypassing established regulatory safeguards designed to ensure the substance's quality, safety and efficacy. And substances used for assisted dying should be manufactured in accordance with MHRA requirements, rather than being prepared locally by individual pharmacies.